Now that we have seen the causes of the loss of biodiversity, let's try to analyze the impact that the loss of biodiversity would have. And this impact basically has to be divided into two parts. First part is ecological effects, and the second one will be economic and societal effects. So first let's try to analyze the ecological effects that the loss of biodiversity will have. So first is inbreeding. Now, why are we talking about inbreeding? What we discussed, as you go back to habitat destruction or habitat loss, fragmentation, etc., that we studied, we discussed that the population will be confined in a smaller area. And once it has been confined to a smaller area, it will not have a better gene pool. The reproduction that will happen, the breeding that will happen, the mating that will happen, it will happen in a very small confined area, and slowly and steadily the genetic diversity of the given species will start to decrease. And this is why we are talking about inbreeding, and inbreeding ultimately will lead to bigger problems. So for example, once inbreeding happens, we know that the species ultimately will die off, and it will have a greater impact on the given ecosystem where it lived. Then after that, the second point is it lowers an ecosystem's productivity. What is the meaning of productivity? Basically, you can say that this is the conversion of food energy into biomass. So, with the loss of biodiversity, what we'll see is that the productivity of an ecosystem will decrease. That is, all the plants and animals, all the species that you have in a given ecosystem, they will now start to show less productivity. That is, what we know is that there will be lesser number of plants and animals in a given ecosystem, and because the numbers are lesser, that's why the amount of biomass that you will produce from a given ecosystem will reduce. It is simple, the numbers have reduced, and because of the reduced numbers, now the entire productivity of a given ecosystem will also reduce, because there are not enough plants and animals to give you the amount of productivity that you might have wanted. Now the next point is the lowering of quality of ecosystem services. So what will happen is, basically, because of the reduction in biodiversity, the natural purification of water that might have happened will not happen anymore. The natural purification of air through trees, etc., will not happen anymore. Other services, let's say, even if you talk about forest products, for example, as simple as firewood, you will not have enough firewood now. So ecosystem services in total will start to decrease. Then after that, it threatens the structure and proper functioning of the ecosystem. Just think of the habitat and niche. Think of this in that manner, that what we are doing is that the structure of ecosystem is being destroyed, the natural habitat is being destroyed, and because of that we'll see big behavioral changes in all the organisms that live in that area. And because of that, what will happen, ultimately we'll see that their niche will start to change, their behavior, their food patterns, etc., will start to change, their role in a given ecosystem might start to change, and ultimately again it will be a problem for humans as well. And lastly, there is another impact that it will have, and that is ecosystem homogenization. What is the meaning of this? This basically means that there are two ecosystems, and which are, let's say, spatially different from one another, they are separated from one another, and what we observe is that the ecosystem starts to become similar. If you go back and understand, we had discussed measurement of biodiversity, and in measurement of biodiversity we had discussed about beta diversity. So what was beta diversity? The difference that we were looking at between the two ecosystems, right? So if you just recall it, we had discussed that if there are, let's say, A, B and C, and here you have B, D and E, in that case we know that B is common, so beta diversity would be 2 from here and 2 from here, that is 2 plus 2 equal to 4. So what will happen here is that ultimately we will see that the beta diversity will decrease. That now we don't have any of, let's say, D here, or we don't have any of A here, and ultimately now this has become 1 plus 1 equal to 2. That is, the beta diversity of these two ecosystems compared has decreased now. and this is something that will be observed. Ecosystem homogenization happens. Usually it will happen because of something like invasive species which have started to invade a given ecosystem, and it has started to replace the native species in the given region. So then it will lead to ecosystem homogenization. Sometimes it is also called as biotic homogenization. So this is the first aspect of impact on of loss of biodiversity, that is all the ecological effects. Then we come to all the economic and societal effects. So first could be it threatens global food security and the development of new pharmaceuticals to deal with future diseases. So what we know is that genetic diversity will decrease, species diversity will decrease, and ultimately the number of food crops that we will have will start to decrease. For example, you might know that okay, we have only 10 to 15 major food crops today. But ultimately, if you look at all the plant sources that we have, which are sources of our food, then in that case, it's more than 7,000 such species which are a source of food for us. So ultimately, we are looking at this number, and this number will drastically start to decrease, and many of the food sources that we have today will start to vanish. So this is something that will happen with the loss of biodiversity. Similarly, the development of new pharmaceuticals to deal with future diseases. We basically can talk about all the biological resources that we get. All the biological resources that we get from the ecosystem, we can talk about that. So many of the principles of medicines or pharmaceuticals or different combinations are gathered from the behavior of organisms or the chemicals that are found in various organisms, and then it is processed and a medicine is made out of it. So many of the things may not even be recognized till now, we may not be able to even know about it, and before we knowing about it, it will die off. And the kinds of developments it might have led to, the kinds of medicines breakthroughs that it might have provided, we'll never be able to get that. So that's one. Then economic scarcities among common food crops. So obviously, because the food crops, the diversity in the food crops will decrease, then what will happen is that there will be an increase in prices. We'll see that it will have a negative impact on the kinds of food crops that are left out. Then after that, medicines, as we discussed, that because of loss of biodiversity, we will see these kind of issues, that the sources of medicines will start to vanish. Then the cultural significance. Now, you know that in many of the ancient religions, especially even if you talk about India, we know that the older Indic religions plus the tribal religions, they have always been following various plants and various animals which have been worshipped. And all these significances also start to get lost because you don't have these resources anymore, because these plants and animals have also started to vanish, and ultimately we might lose the connection with these species which have been very sacred to us, which have been holy to us in various religions and in various cultures. So this is again another significance, another societal significance, you can say. Then the diseases. As the genetic diversity starts to decrease, you will see that if the diseases start to affect one species, then that species may not be able to survive. This is one very strong example that is given in case of banana. Banana normally is a plantation, and what we have seen is that the diversity in banana, or the genetic diversity in banana, is very less. So because of that, what is said is that if there is a major outbreak of a disease in case of bananas, then in that case probably bananas will not be able to survive anymore. And this basically holds true for any species, even if you talk about humans. So today you know that humans are genetically very varied. If you go to different regions of the earth, you know that Asians look very different from Africans, Africans look very different from Europeans. So the Caucasian skin is different from the Asian skin, or this, even in Asia, the Western Asian skin is different from the Eastern Asian skin. So all this is coming from the genetic diversity that we have, and because of the genetic diversity, we might be able to survive for longer. But same may not be the case for the species which are losing out on their diversity. Whether you talk about species diversity, whether you talk about genetic diversity, in both the cases, they are losing out, and ultimately that will be the downfall of these species. Then after that, the recreational space. As you lose biodiversity, you lose out the areas, you lose out the ecosystems, and because of that, the recreational areas, the forested areas, etc., they are also lost over time. So ultimately, societal point of view, you can say this, that recreational space also is vanishing little by little. So although this might not look to be a very strong impact, but yes, we know that all the others are very, very important impacts to look at. So this is how you can talk about impact of loss of biodiversity, whether in ecological terms or in economic and societal terms.